November 21st, 1970, 2:18 in the morning. The jungle outside Son Tay prison camp sits 23 miles west of Hanoi, so close to the North Vietnamese capital that on a clear night you can see the city lights. Inside the compound, North Vietnamese guards are asleep. Routine, quiet. Another uneventful night on what has to be one of the most boring postings in the entire war. They have no idea that 56 of the most dangerous men the United States Army has ever produced are 2 minutes away, and one of those men is about to fly a helicopter directly into the prison wall, on purpose. But to understand why an American pilot deliberately crashed a government helicopter into a fortified enemy compound, and why that decision was not a mistake but the whole plan, we need to go back about a year, to a room inside the Pentagon where a group of officers stared at surveillance photographs and made a decision that would become one of the most audacious special operations missions in American military history. By 1970, the United States had been in Vietnam for the better part of a decade. The war was deeply unpopular at home, casualties were mounting, troop withdrawals had begun, and somewhere in the prison camps scattered across North Vietnam, hundreds of American servicemen were being held in conditions that can only be described as deliberate cruelty. Torture was not an exception, it was policy. The Hanoi Hilton, officially Hoa Lo prison, had become a symbol of that brutality. Men were subjected to rope bindings, stress positions, solitary confinement that lasted for years. Some prisoners had been held since 1964, 6 years, in a cage. The US government knew, and for years the answer to that knowledge was, there is nothing we can do. Then a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst looked at a satellite photograph of Son Tay prison and circled something in red ink. Prisoners, approximately 61 of them, 23 miles from Hanoi. Someone decided that was close enough to try. The mission was called Operation Ivory Coast. The planning officer was Brigadier General Donald Blackburn, and the man chosen to lead the ground assault was Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, a name that sounds like it was assigned by a Hollywood casting director, but was completely real and completely earned. Simons had fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He was 52 years old. He had the kind of face that suggested he had personally invented several ways to end a conversation permanently. The Pentagon could not have picked a better man. Here is what they built. At Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, the US military constructed a full-scale replica of Son Tay prison. Not a rough approximation, a replica. Every wall, every guard tower, every internal courtyard, reconstructed in the Florida panhandle so that 56 Special Forces soldiers could practice the raid. Again, and again, and again. They ran the rehearsal 170 times. 170. By the time the actual mission launched, these men had memorized Son Tay prison better than the guards who lived there. But there was one problem they couldn't rehearse. One detail that made the whole plan look, on paper, completely impossible. Because Son Tay prison had a courtyard, and that courtyard was too small for a helicopter to land. So the answer was simple. Don't land. Crash. The assault was divided into 3 elements: Blue Boy, Red Wine, and Green Leaf. Each had a specific job. Blue Boy, traveling aboard the HH-3E helicopter designated Apple 1, had the most direct assignment: get inside the prison compound walls, neutralize the guards in the courtyard, and hold it. The courtyard was roughly 60 feet wide. An HH-3E has a rotor diameter of 62 feet. You see the problem. A standard landing was impossible. A hover and rope insertion would take too long and expose the helicopter to ground fire. So the mission planners made a decision that sounds like something a 12-year-old would suggest in a video game. Crash the helicopter into the courtyard on purpose. At controlled speed. Into the wall. Then everyone walks out, does the job, and gets picked up by a different helicopter on the way out. Major Herb Kalin was the pilot assigned to Apple 1. He was asked to intentionally destroy a perfectly functional military aircraft by flying it into a prison wall at 2 in the morning, behind enemy lines, 23 miles from the North Vietnamese capital. He said yes. Obviously, the plan was for Apple 1 to clip the prison's guard tower with the rotor, bleed off speed, and put the aircraft down hard inside the compound. Not a crash in the traditional sense, more like a very aggressive, very intentional, very controlled arrival. In theory, the crew would walk away, the helicopter would not, and that was just the entry plan. Because while Apple One was making its very enthusiastic entrance, something else entirely was about to happen 400 meters to the south, something nobody planned. Something that, depending on who you ask, might have been the most lethally effective thing that happened all night. Bull Simons led the Greenleaf element, 22 men, aboard a separate helicopter. Their job was to land in a field outside the prison walls, set up a blocking position, and prevent any North Vietnamese reinforcements from reaching the compound. Simon's helicopter landed in the wrong location, not by much. 400 meters south of the actual prison, there was a secondary compound, a large structure referred to in mission planning as the secondary school. It was not the target. It had been identified as a potential concern but was not believed to house significant enemy forces. It was full of soldiers. What happened next lasted roughly 2 minutes. 22 Green Berets, who had rehearsed this raid 170 times and were operating at the absolute peak of their tactical capability, made contact with, by most accounts, somewhere between 100 and 200 armed enemy troops. Bull Simons, 60 seconds into landing in the wrong place, realized his mistake. He also realized he could do something about it first. When Simons and his men extracted and rejoined the main assault, the secondary compound had been comprehensively dealt with. The after-action estimates of enemy casualties at that location alone were, to put it diplomatically, significant. Some reports suggested upward of 100 enemy killed by 22 men in 2 minutes in the wrong location. Meanwhile, at the actual prison, Apple One was making its entrance, and the Son Tay raid was officially, irrevocably, in motion. 2:19 a.m. Apple One came in low and fast. Kalen walked the aircraft into the guard tower exactly as planned, absorbed the impact, and put the helicopter down inside the compound. Hard. The aircraft was destroyed. The crew walked out. Blue Boy element, 14 Green Berets, poured out of the wreckage and immediately went to work. The North Vietnamese guards had approximately 0 seconds to react. The outer assault element had already neutralized the guard towers. Redwine was holding the perimeter. The entire compound was under American control within minutes. They moved to the cell blocks, breached the doors, cleared the rooms. Empty. Another cell block. Empty. Every room. Empty. Son Tay prison, on the night of November 21, 1970, contained not a single American prisoner of war. The men had been moved 4 months earlier, in July. The Son Tay area had experienced severe flooding, and the North Vietnamese had relocated all prisoners to a facility called Camp Faith, closer to Hanoi. The intelligence that launched the most meticulously planned rescue mission in American military history was 4 months out of date. The raid lasted 27 minutes. Every Green Beret made it out alive. 0 American KIA. 0 American MIA. 2 men wounded, neither critically. They had executed the plan with near-perfect precision. The right target, at the right time, with overwhelming force, and found an empty prison. Now here is where most people stop the story. And those people are missing the most important part. Because the Son Tay raid didn't fail. Not really. What it did was something far more interesting. And for the men rotting in those Hanoi cells, something they would later describe as a turning point. In the immediate aftermath, the raid was publicly declared a failure. No prisoners rescued. No tangible military result. Congress demanded answers. The press called it an embarrassing intelligence breakdown. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird spent several uncomfortable days explaining why the United States military had raided an empty prison. Privately, something else was happening. The North Vietnamese government, rattled by the realization that American special forces had penetrated to within 23 miles of their capital without being detected, made a strategic decision. They consolidated all American POWs scattered across multiple camps throughout North Vietnam into a single facility, the Hanoi Hilton. On the surface, that sounds like a punishment. It was not. Not entirely. Inside the Hanoi Hilton, the prisoners were together for the first time in years. Senior officers could finally command. Communication networks, painstakingly built through tapped walls and passed notes, could operate at full capacity. Morale, which had been systematically destroyed by isolation, began to rebuild. American prisoners who had spent years in solitary confinement suddenly had 250 men around them. Many of them later said it saved their lives. James Stockdale, a senior naval officer who would spend 7.5 years as a prisoner of war and who later received the Medal of Honor, described the consolidation as a pivotal moment in the survival of the prisoner community. The isolation had been a weapon. The consolidation removed it. Son Tay didn't rescue the prisoners. It changed the conditions of their captivity in ways that mattered. Here are the numbers. 56 Special Forces soldiers inserted into North Vietnam, 0 killed, 2 wounded, 27 minutes on the ground, approximately 100 to 200 enemy casualties across both engagements, 1 helicopter intentionally destroyed, 1 secondary compound mistakenly assaulted with catastrophic effectiveness, 0 prisoners recovered, and yet every man who made that raid walked or was carried back to American lines. In a war defined by attrition, ambiguity, and strategic failure, a mission with those numbers is not a defeat, it is an anomaly. The Son Tay raid became a foundational case study in special operations planning. The principles used to build it, isolation training, full-scale rehearsal, multi-element simultaneous assault, deliberate crash insertion, showed up in doctrine that shaped American special operations for the next 50 years. The techniques refined for Ivory Coast influenced every hostage rescue framework the US military developed afterward. Delta Force, founded in 1977, drew directly from the lessons of Son Tay. The infrastructure of the modern Tier 1 special operations community has Son Tay's fingerprints all over it. Bull Simons, for his part, was not finished. In 1979, now retired, he would lead a private rescue operation into revolutionary Iran to extract employees of Ross Perot's company from a Tehran prison. He succeeded. He was 61 years old. Some men are simply built differently. November 21st, 1970, 2:18 in the morning. 23 miles from Hanoi, a helicopter full of Green Berets flew into a prison wall on purpose. The compound was empty. Every man came home. And 300 American prisoners of war, locked in cells they had no reason to believe they would ever leave, were moved into the same building, and for the first time in years, were not alone. The raid that rescued no one may have saved everyone. If you made it this far, you already know what kind of channel this is. And you're exactly who we make these for. Hit subscribe if this is your kind of story, because we've got a lot more where this came from. And if you've got a father, a grandfather, or a buddy who spent time in that war, share this one with them. They'll know exactly what this raid meant.